Welcome to another Hybrid Talk, the podcast where we discuss the future of brand, business, and marketing. Today I have with me Professor Robert Jones. Robert Jones is the founder of Brandland and has over 30 years of experience as a brand strategist with the global agency Wolf Olins and as a Norfolk Brand independent. He worked with some of UK's and international biggest companies to build their brands, including Aviva, Barclays, Oxfam, PwC, National Trust, Tate, Tesco, Virgin, and Wikipedia. Professor Jones is leading the brand leadership course in the University of East Anglia, where he set up the world's only MSc in brand leadership. He's also the author of The Big Idea in Branding, a very short introduction. Professor Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. It's nice to be here.
So, how did your journey begin with brand?
It began even before the word brand, really. I think from when I was a teenager, I was fascinated by design. I used to read a magazine called Design Magazine, and quite often saw corporate identity design work done by a company in London called Wolf Olins. And from that point onwards, I was interested in design, corporate identity, and actually Wolf Olins as well. And many years later, after time at university and working for a startup in Cambridge, I applied for a job at Wolf Olins, which would be my dream job, really. And luckily enough, got the job. But we didn't talk about brand in those days. It was corporate identity. And we weren't allowed to use the word logo. We had to say corporate mark. So there was a kind of, there was quite a sort of serious approach to corporate identity, which had been created by Wally Olins, one of the founders of Wolf Olins, who wrote the books really that defined the subject of corporate identity. And we were following on from him. He was still very much around, very much in the business. His desk was next to mine when I started, and he was a terrifying figure until you got to know him. He could be very brusque, if not actually very rude. But he was a very effective, not just an effective salesperson, but a very effective communicator. And he really created the market for corporate identity, at least on this side of the Atlantic. And it was only a few years later when we started working for a new mobile business called Orange, that we began to think, or some of us began to think, that actually what we're doing is better described as brand than as corporate identity. And then there was a bit of an internal battle between the people who believed in brand and the people like Wally who believed in corporate identity. But the concept of brand won. Although I still think in lots of ways identity is a better word to describe the importance and the depth of what we all do in branding. Branding sounds like something that's applied to the surface of something. You kind of stick a brand on it, whereas identity is what comes from inside, and it's kind of the reality of who you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's a better way of thinking about what we're trying to do in branding.
Branding, positioning. Even nowadays, it's some industry words that might be confusing to a lot, even to practitioners. But what was the pivotal moment in Wolf Olins that urged you to move into the transition of corporate identity and then calling it brand?
I think it was that most of the work that Wolf Olins had done was to do with organizations and companies, and Orange was really more about a service or a product. And when you start to think about the branding of or identity of a product or a service in order to sell it to consumers, then it feels more natural to use the word brand, which has that kind of commercial edge to it, I think. And, I think it was also just, this is a kind of fashion industry, isn't it? And the fashion was to start to talk about the word brand. But you're absolutely right that all of these words, brand and positioning and proposition and values, and brand equity, all of these things have no fixed meaning. And that's one of the reasons why I set up the master's course in brand leadership, to try to teach people some kind of definition, some fixed definition of what all of these words could mean. Because and this still happens so often in meetings, particularly with advertising agencies, where we're all using the same words, but we mean really very different things by them. And we don't necessarily realize that. So you can be talking at cross purposes, and this is not good. The business of branding ought to be a little bit more professional and a little bit more rigorous, I think, and also a lot more ethical. And those were really the reasons for kicking off the course that I teach.
Who navigates, in your opinion, the identity of the brand? Is it the organization? Is it the professional? Is it the marketing agency? Is it the brand agency? Is it the designer? Where does it come from? I mean, the core DNA.
It has to come from inside the organization, and one of the things that I was talking about the internal battle in Wolff Olins between brand and corporate identity. Wally Olins stood up for corporate identity, but the guy who stood up for brand was our creative director at the time, Doug Hamilton. And Doug always used to make a really important distinction between confection brands and conviction brands. Confection are the ones where an agency applies something from the outside. Conviction is something that comes from what the people inside the business really actually believe. And I think that word conviction is so important. Great brands come with conviction. And when you're doing a branding project or a rebranding project with a client as a consultant, the most important thing that you're trying to create is conviction in the client that this is right and this is what we believe in. And just before this podcast this morning, I read an email from my biggest current client about an internal conference they'd just had, where our new brand positioning and design was being launched to senior managers, and apparently went down fantastically well. But what was so pleasing about the email was that this was people inside the organization who had created the presentation and delivered it. I had nothing to do with it. And this is the moment where I kind of feel my work is done, really. And that's because my focus all the way through the last 6 months on this project has been to draw ideas from the client rather than apply my own ideas to them. So the conviction is really there. And so I now feel very confident that this piece of work is going to be successful because there is so much belief in it inside the organization, independent of me.
Definitely. And maybe most of the times our work as professionals is to facilitate change and help people see things from an outer lens instead of imposing our knowledge and expertise and trying to navigate.
Yes.
What I'm trying to do sometimes at Hybrid for our own clients to explain how broad this is.
Yes.
I'm starting with the word intention.
Yes.
So what is your intention? What is your brand?
What is your intention, or what is your ambition, is what I sometimes start with. I completely agree. I think it's a facilitator role. I think it is also often an educator role, because, as you say, most people don't live in the world of branding all the time like you and I. So why would they think about its potential and its breadth and its full meaning? So there's an education role, I think. And I think just occasionally there is also a leadership role, which is not, I don't mean by that kind of taking over and taking charge, but I do mean exciting and enthusing and giving perhaps people just a little bit the courage to go a bit further.
Yeah. So it's mostly the role of a coach, let's say, of
Yeah.
of
The
a
role
team trying to excel.
the role of a coach, and one of my favorite sayings, which we used to talk about in Wolf Olins, which I still think is really helpful, is very much the kind of thing a coach would say, which is to say to a client, there's a zone of comfort and there's a zone of opportunity, and the two things are never the same. So that if you are looking at a piece of work and feeling really comfortable about it, that's a bad sign. It needs to feel uncomfortable to start with, and giving and acting as a coach and giving a client the kind of the confidence to relax a bit and go with something that might feel a bit strange and different. A crucial part of our role.
And also, a lot of the times, it's not something that you fall in love to, right? It just, if it's right, it doesn't mean that the highest paying person in the room needs to love it. But they need to be on board with it.
No, and I think perhaps the hardest thing that we have to do as brand consultants is naming a brand, and I think it's natural to assume in that process that there is the perfect name around, and that when you see it, you will love it, and that isn't never the case. And even just what I mentioned, Orange, the mobile brand that we created 30 years ago, the CEO at the time said, over my blank, blank, blank dead body, do we call it Orange?
Yeah.
It was the opposite of loving it. He hated it. But it was the right name. Yeah. And it stuck and it stayed and it's still used. It doesn't exist in Britain, but it's the name that France Telecom uses for all of its operations. So it was the right name, but it felt to lots of people like exactly the wrong name when it was first put forward.
Yeah. Do you think all brands, because you mentioned in one of your books about the big idea, do you think all brands need the big idea in order to achieve a successful brand?
Yeah, we were talking about this with with my students last week. My feeling is that they do, because all the forces in an organization, particularly a large one, are towards complication and dilution and misinterpretation and fragmentation. Where if you've got a single driving idea that people can keep coming back to, that's a very powerful counter to all of that. And I guess my favorite one ever is nothing to do with me, but it's IKEA and that concept of a better everyday life for the many people. It's very strange English, but a better everyday life for the many people. I think they've been talking about that in IKEA since the 1940s. And it's such a simple thought, and it's actually more important to have a simple and human and emotional thought than it is to have a really clever piece of copywriting or a slogan or anything like that. And I'm always tempted to try to find a really smart and elegant piece of English, but that isn't what works in my experience. What works is something that people in the organization understand and relate to and can use actually day to day.
Totally agree with you. And let's move a little bit towards brand leadership. Over the past months, I've had the opportunity to work as a fractional marketing manager in-house as a head of branded marketing. And what I realized is that managing a brand is not what you think it is. So you are responsible for the budgeting, for the healthiness of the brand, and maybe there is not a lot of creativity involved, especially in a corporate world. So how do you how do you express the ideal role of a brand leader nowadays?
I think you're right, and a friend of mine who was at Wolf Olins and went to a company to be head of brand used to talk about it. It's like a pizza, and the stuff that we did at Wolf Olins, the creative stuff, is just one slice of that pizza, and there are so many other slices, and a lot of them are really boring, and they're to do with budgets and things. So I completely agree. But I do think there's a difference of mindset between the idea of a brand manager and a brand leader.
Yeah.
And a brand leader does have to do all of those management things like budgeting. But a brand leader can also at least try and push things more creatively and be a little bit of a visionary in the organization. Definitely be a coach in the organization, because brand building depends on what everybody in the company does. It's not what the people in the brand department do. So it's beyond the control, strictly speaking, of a brand manager. So therefore, you have to be able to coach people outside your own department in what it would mean, what the brand might mean for the customer service team, for example, or the innovation team, or HR, or any other part of the organization. So there's a kind of coaching role. And then I think increasingly there is a sort of data scientist role as well. Not because data is the most important thing in the world, but because that we now have so much of it, and potentially it is useful, and it is certainly useful to back up ideas with people at a senior level in the organization who, in my experience, tend to be more convinced by data than by colorful storytelling.
Yeah.
So I think there is a kind of visionary philosopher role, there's a data scientist role, there's a coach role, and all of those are perhaps just a little bit more than a conventional brand manager role. I mean, for me, the difference is managers manage things how they are, and leaders change things, really.
Yeah. And draw the line forward.
And exactly, kind of pushing forward and trying to make sure that the work that's being done this year is going to work for next year and the year after and the year after that. And that's a big difference, I think, between what we branding people do and often what advertising people do is the timescale. And a campaign has got to deliver results in weeks, usually days, whereas brand building, as we know, is a long-term thing and a long-term investment. And all the work that I've done that I'm proudest of is work that has lasted, really. So you're quite right. It's all about pushing forward, and it's about trying to find the stuff that is going to last, not the stuff that is trendy or answering to some current fashion or fad, but that will last. And then when it does, I think that becomes then very exciting. But it is that long-term thing. The client that I mentioned that I've been working with for the last 6 months, the way we started the process was a workshop with a cross-section of their people, chosen to be kind of imaginative people. And what I asked them to do was to come along and bring a photo of the thing that you've seen in your organization that you're proudest of in the last year. So what we were looking for was stuff that was true and had been done, but was new and emerging. And we built the brand idea or the brand positioning on that really, on what is, and I think that's the place to look. What in the organisation is exciting and emerging, because that's the best chance of creating something that will last beyond this year and next year, and perhaps into the next 10 years. So I completely agree with you.
Mentioning this, I was thinking now that I'm always debating inside my head whether a brand should be built or navigated through its consumers, so it's customer oriented, or through the organization, so let's say it's company oriented.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that if you're customer oriented, you are also building a culture of customer orientation, and then also your people are feeling the same way, right?
Yes. Yeah, I agree, and I think the way I tend to think about this is a Venn diagram with two circles. So one of the circles is what we've just been talking about, which is what is special and exciting and emerging in the organization. But the other circle is what's wrong in your world, and that is about consumers, but it isn't just consumers. It could include the public who are not consumers. It could include governments, investors, kind of wide range of stakeholders. But if you can find something that is really exciting about the organization that helps with something that is wrong in the world that organization works in, then you end up with something exciting and something that's got a sense of kind of purpose and cause and mission to it, which is what can is what can really excite and motivate people. So I think it is both, but you probably have to start inside.
Yeah. Recently, my hometown, Larnaca, is pitching for European City of Heritage. And this is how I discovered Brandland, because I was fascinated with the way people are being activated from a single presentation. So the curator, the person responsible for Larnaca 2030 presented the pitch, what we're gonna be positioned as, what we stand for, etc., etc. And then you see a lot of clusters from the local community being activated and co-creating. From the arts, from the business world, from cultural teams, and etc. So this is how I discovered Brandland, and I would like you to tell us a few things about it.
Well, the university where I teach, the University of East Anglia, is in a city called Norwich, and as a kind of outsider coming into Norwich, because I've mostly lived in London, Norwich seemed to me to be unusual among cities in the number of kind of pioneering brands that come from Norwich, and also the number of creative agencies and freelancers and so on. So, for example, Barclays Bank can trace its origins back to Norwich. Aviva, the big insurance company, started off as Norwich Union. And both of these are 200, 300 years old. And I think I'm right in saying that the very first example of product branding in the world came from Norwich, which is Coleman's mustard. There's a guy called Jeremiah Coleman who inherited his father's company when he was only, I think, 23, and had the idea, instead of sending his mustard product out in plain brown wrappers, he would put colourful yellow wrappers round with a logo and a picture, and create a branded project. And that was in the 1850s, which is 20 years before people like Coca-Cola. So I think there's lots of kind of brand origin stories in Norwich, which has fascinated me. But I also observed that all the people working in branding in Norwich didn't really talk to each other very much. And that therefore there was the potential to create a cluster, an economic cluster, where you have as much interaction as you possibly can, plus a lot of interaction with the local university, or actually there are 2 universities in Norwich, so both of them. And in that way, you can kind of turbocharge what's going on, create a lot more work, attract a lot more talent, create some really useful economic benefits by encouraging this kind of cluster. So that's what we did. And for a while, it was very boringly called Brand Cluster Norwich. And then we used one of the local brand agencies, The Click, who were very good, to develop this thing called Brandland. So that was the name that we chose. And like all names, that wasn't necessarily obviously the right one at the time, but it's landed. Excuse the pun. And so we've been Brandland for the last couple of years. We've got a surprising number of people who are members or who follow us on LinkedIn. So there's actually a lot more interest than even I'd thought. And it's been a surprising success. And actually later this month, we're running our 2nd annual conference, which will be not at the University of East Anglia, but at the other one, Norwich University of the Arts. We've got this really amazing new, beautiful, award-winning building that we're going to be in. And I'm very excited. We've got lots of really good content. It's all about how can branding be better for people and better for the planet. But we're going to kick off with the vice chancellors, that's the bosses of both of the 2 universities, who I think kind of rarely share a stage. So that will be interesting in itself, talking about the role of universities in stimulating creativity in a city. That's the beginning. And then at the end, we've got the Chief Customer Officer from Primark talking partly about her career, Michelle McKettrick, as a brand director, first at Barclays and then at Tesco, now at Primark. Michelle also did the very famous creative writing course at the University of East Anglia a few years ago, so she has a Norwich connection there as well. But also talking about Primark, and in fact, I was chatting to her yesterday, and the story of what Primark is doing in the area of sustainability and ethical business is actually quite extraordinary and not known to the public. So her job, she's the very first, she's the kind of brand leader, but called Chief Customer Officer. So she's the very first person to have that role even in Primark. So Primark has only recently thought about managing its brand in a conscious way. And a big part of her job is to communicate these surprising truths about Primark, which of course is tricky because the more you talk about them, the more it sounds like you're just doing greenwash. So it's a very hard balance to achieve. But anyway, that's going to be the keynote at the end of the conference. So that kind of gives you an idea of the sorts of things that we try and do in Brandland. Kind of hopefully over time putting Norwich on the creative map. That's the plan. It's early days, really. It's a lot still to do.
Wow, very interesting. So, as an academic and a practitioner, where do you see brand and branding going into the future with AI being evolved, over tactification without strategy, technology giving you the ability to build a corporate identity in 5 minutes? So, what is your position in these developments?
I think. Well, I think branding is a very central human activity, and it's something that human beings have done for thousands and thousands of years in one form or another. So it will continue. We will carry on doing it as long as there are human beings. I think that the the trend in the last 10 years or so for brands to have a social purpose will settle down. That's all been kind of exaggerated and hyped.
Yeah.
But organizations will be expected to be corporate citizens and not just profit maximizers. I think so brand will play its part in that. And artificial intelligence will be will be like an extra member of the team in creating brands, and I think that's fine. However, I still feel that there is that the well, who knows where artificial intelligence could go, but the way that generative AI works is crudely by writing a word and then thinking what's the most likely word that will follow that word, and then writing that word, and then what's the most likely word after that, and writing that. And that's kind of predictive, generative, and fine. But you and I know that good branding is the opposite of that. Is what the next word you get is exactly the word that you weren't expecting. It's going back to this point about the zone of comfort and the zone of opportunity. And at the moment, AI keeps us very much in the zone of comfort because it's all about prediction and it's all built on previous patterns. So I'm hoping that there will be a role for human beings in doing the opposite of that, in the kind of the really weird, completely unpredictable, completely irrational, unreasonable thing that then generates something like, you're selling trainers and your slogan doesn't mention shoes at all. It just says, just do it. I don't think I could quite get to that yet.
But it works.
But it works because it is it's crazy and unexpected. And for years in Britain, and I think in other countries too, Audi cars have been sold with the slogan "Vorsprung durch Technik," and I'm guessing most people don't even know what that means. So it's crazy, but it doesn't matter because it works, because it says this is a clever technical German car,
and it feels safe and it feels advanced.
Exactly. So these kinds of things, and those are just little examples, kind of strapline slogans, but that kind of thinking is human creativity, really, which I'm not sure we're yet seeing from artificial intelligence,
which is hard to copy or replicate.
Exactly. But AI will do a lot of the background work, the research, the synthesis of stuff that's already out in the world. I had my first yesterday meeting where the meeting report was written by AI, and it was kind of an intelligent summary of the meeting. It missed some of the nuances, which I would have picked out more if I'd been writing the summary, but it was adequate. And
but you got 80% of it there, right?
Yeah, but kind of adequate sounds rude. It was quite elegantly written.
It found most of it.
Yeah. So I find all of this very exciting. One of the things that's interesting about teaching is that you've got this annual cycle. The course lasts a year, so you teach it, and then another year comes around and you teach it again. And every year there is a different trend or thing to talk about. And 3 years ago it was blockchain and crypto and all of that stuff. Then it was the metaverse, and those are things that are still around, but they've not really entered mainstream life. But AI is different, and that's because of ChatGPT, and I think it's a much more significant change in our world. One of my ex-students, I was talking to her yesterday, has created an app on the back of ChatGPT that will create a brand strategy, and it's very clever. It takes 15 minutes. It asks you a number of very, very carefully written questions about your organization or your product. So you answer those, which takes 15 minutes, and then within a few seconds you get a pretty intelligent brand strategy.
Wow.
And you even get some website about us text. And it's not as good as something I hope that you or I would create, because it doesn't have anything surprising in it, really. But if you're a really small business with no money to spend, it's certainly better than nothing. So I find that fascinating, but I find it good, really. I don't find it scary.
Yeah, and I think the creative industry always wants to have their own input in the keynote, in the proposal, in the brief. So it's kind of hard to imagine that there's going to be an automated version of creating brands or building identities and developing the whole visual and everything around it.
Well, we should have this. We should talk again in 5 years' time, shouldn't we, Demetrius? And just see, because I think that's true, but I'm not sure. We'll see.
Yeah. The future will tell.
The future, and I think on the future there's something that perhaps is worth saying, which is that you can't predict the future. You can only invent it. Meaning the future is the very thing that we don't know. That's what the future is. So you can't really people who claim to predict it, people who analyze trends, all of that kind of stuff. It's all nonsense. They can't know. All we can do is use whatever powers we have to try to create the future we want to see, and rather than trying to second guess what's actually going to happen. So I think, and those of us who work in branding are lucky, because it's quite a powerful tool for creating a future, and hopefully a good one. I think we should, we focus on doing that rather than on guessing what might happen. Yeah,
and putting notions into motion with
yes,
branding.
Okay, yes, exactly.
So that was a very insightful talk. I couldn't be thankful enough to you for your time and your insights. To close it off, what would be a single piece of advice you would like to give to someone wanting to work in the creative industry in branding?
Well, obviously to do my course at UEA.
Definitely.
My piece of advice comes from I talked about Wally Olins, one of the founders of Wolf Olins. The other one is Michael Wolff, who is still alive and still going, and actually has a book that's just about to be published. And Michael Wolff came to talk to my students a few years ago, and one of them asked, "What's the secret of creativity?" And in some ways, that's quite close to the question of what's the one thing that you should do if you want a creative career. And he said observation. the most important thing is to go around the world just looking at things and thinking about why they are the way they are and could they be better. But it all comes from just endlessly observing. And for that reason, I have a whole segment in my class every Monday where I just ask the students, what have you seen last week that's interesting? Because if I can encourage that constant pattern of habit of observation, then I think that's a long way to encouraging creativity.
Yeah, great. Professor Robert Jones, thank you very much. Wishing you all the best for today and into the future.
Thank you very much,
And
Dimitri. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.